live starting in just a minute as well on our companion network, C-SPAN. Let us know what you think also Congress should be working on as they return for these next 2 weeks before their next break. You can weigh in on our Facebook page. It's facebook.com/cspan. Join the conversation. We'll get some of your comments on the air today.
The Senate will come to order. The chaplain, Dr. Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. Eternal God, your presence fills us with reverential awe, for we find delight in your commands. Even in darkness, your light dawns for those who love you. And so, Lord, as we begin the next phase of the work of the Senate, give us greater confidence in the power of your providential purposes. Remind our lawmakers that the hearts of governmental leaders are in your hands, yielding to the wisdom of your sovereign will. Help us, Lord, to get to know you and love you so we can serve you as we should. We pray in your mighty name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., September 10, 2012. To the Senate. On the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Richard Blumenthal, a senator from the state of Connecticut, to perform the duties of the chair, son Daniel K. Inouye, President pro tempore.
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I welcome everyone back, staff, and of course, presiding officer. I hope you all had a restful and productive month, and I look forward to this work period, which will be very short and compact, and I hope we can accomplish a few things. Mr. President, I want to take just a minute and talk about Congressman Ryan's math, Paul Ryan's math, his arithmetic. It's very interesting. He said he ran a marathon, which a marathon is 26.2 miles long. And being questioned by the press, he said he ran it in about 2 hours and 50 minutes. You know, that's pretty fast. So I'd like to just take a minute and apply the Ryan math to my marathon times. I'll just pick one marathon time. I ran the Boston Marathon. And using the Ryan math, my time would not have been a world's record, but within minutes of a world record. I could have made the Olympic team. Using Ryan math, I would have been superb. Well, the Ryan math doesn't work in marathons because, you know what, Mr. President, you can always check someone's math. And his math doesn't work for running a marathon or anything else. The Ryan math doesn't work with his budgets. It doesn't work with Medicare. It doesn't work with his tax plan. It doesn't work with anything that he has suggested and opined on. No more than his little assertion that I guess he thought no one would check it out. You know, these races people run, they keep records. All my marathons, they've kept records. So as much as I would like to have the Ryan math apply to my marathons, it doesn't work. Mr. President, the Senate is going to resume its work in a few minutes on the heels of the two conventions that we had, one in Florida, one in North Carolina. The Republicans used their virtually fact-free convention to showcase survival of the richest style of economic policies. Democrats took a different approach. I'm sure we all had our favorites. But, Mr. President, I thought Congressman Cleaver's speech was so terrific. I don't know how many got to see that, but it was great. He was up there, he was marching, he was just outstanding. And then Governor Jennifer Granholm from Michigan. Oh, it was so good as she explained to everyone about jobs, about why Detroit should not have gone bankrupt. I thought Joe Biden's speech was typical for Joe Biden. It was wonderful. I just admired him so much. I served with him for a quarter of a century. But what a good man. He's contributed such valuable service to his country. And we all saw when they were talking about his life story, and we saw when his son introduced him, the tears coming from his eyes. President Ms. Obama's message was very, very clear. They did so well. Mr. President, and Charlotte, Democrats presented Americans with a clear, honest assessment of the challenges we face as a nation, a concrete plan to overcome these problems that we have. But we do it together. That's why President Obama has seen a significant rise in the polls since that convention, all those speeches. Not just his, but all of them. Even Republican-skewed Rasmussen poll had him ahead by 5 points. In fact, we presented Americans with a clear choice as well. It wasn't a choice between two candidates or two parties. It was a choice between two visions. The Romney vision and the vision that we certainly think was pronounced at that convention, the Obama vision. Visions about America's future. The Republican vision would return us to the failed economic policies that brought us to the Great Recession. It would return us to 8 years of the Bush of wars and rumors of wars, massive debt, everything unpaid for. We don't want to go back to that. We can't go back to that. And it would further tilt the playing field in favor of those who already have every advantage. Every advantage. Millionaires and billionaires, they already have an advantage. We don't need to give them any more. President Obama, on the other hand, presented a vision of America where every person has a shot at success. Every person. An America where fairness replaces favoritism. His policies has led to 30 straight months of private sector job growth. Would we like more? Of course we would. I met this morning, Mr. President, with the Harold Scheitberger, the General President of the firefighters. He has been working in the fields of firefighters. He started out as a firefighter. Interesting, Mr. President, he as a boy lived before he was old enough to be a firefighter. His father had died, and he actually lived in a firehouse by himself with the rest of the firefighters. That's where he got the idea that that's what he wanted to do for his life's work. And he has dedicated so much to making America a better place. But, Mr. President, we've had, in my conversation with him, we're approaching 1 million people who have been laid off in the public sector. I'm sure it's happened in Connecticut. It's happened in Nevada, every place. And, Mr. President, we thought that we had a way of solving that problem. You'll recall, you voted, I voted. What we thought we should do to stop the layoffs of firefighters, police officers, and teachers, and we would pay for it, no more debt. We would pay for it by having a 0.3% surtax on people making more than $1 million a year. Presiding officers will remember that. Every Republican voted against public employees. Every Republican. 0.3% it would have taken to take care of all that. So I enjoyed my conversation with President Scheitberger. We lament the fact that all these public employees have been laid off, and we've got to get back to where we can have a public sector that people can handle. They're so overworked. I know in Nevada we have too few firefighters, too few police officers. Teachers have been laid off. That's a shame. Mr. President, we've had 30 straight months of private sector job growth. Too bad the numbers aren't more than 4.5 million, but that's where they are. We lost 8 million jobs in the Bush years. We've gained more than half of them back. We're making progress. Wish we could do better. Everyone acknowledges that. There's more work to be done. Too many Americans are still hurting. So President Obama has a plan for more than 1 million people back to work next year. His plan will create jobs for the middle class, not just profits for the CEOs. Mr. President, we all want profits for these companies. That's good. But we also want to make sure that there's a fair program out there, that we do something to stop the middle class from being squeezed so hard. The CEOs, a lot of them are doing extremely well. Good, I'm happy. But, Mr. President, the Dow is up more than 6,000 points since President Obama took office. 6,000 points. Meanwhile, Mitt Romney's failed to offer a single concrete idea to create good-paying jobs for American workers. I watched part of an interview of Congressman Ryan today. It was a replay from yesterday. I think he was on ABC with George Stephanopoulos. All I could see is the back of Stephanopoulos' head, but I think that's who it was. You know, they're going around saying they want to close these tax loopholes. So Romney's been asked, Ryan's been asked, what loopholes do you want to close? They will not say. It's part of their fictitious math. Because, see, when they start talking about how fast they run a marathon or holes they want to plug, they have to actually give facts. They refuse to do that. Do they want to get rid of charitable donations? Do they want to get rid of the deduction for buying a home? They will not say so. Obviously, why? They're afraid to. So they give you this Ryan math, the Romney math. It just doesn't add up. It's no surprise that Governor Romney has failed to offer a single proposal to create a good-paying job. But that's no surprise. After all, he belongs to the same Republican Party that has put partisan politics ahead of creating jobs for almost 4 years now. In fact, some would say 6 years. We've never had such obstruction in the history of the country, nothing even close, Mr. President. In the 6 years we've had the majority here in the Senate, almost 6 years, we have had to file cloture 380 times. There were times when in a Congress you would file cloture a handful of times, 10 times, 380 times in less than 6 years. This is the same Republican Party whose leader has said his #1 goal is to defeat President Obama, not create jobs for the American people, private sector or public sector. We've been rolling up our sleeves, working to put teachers, firefighters, police, construction workers back on the job. Construction workers. For every $1 billion we spend as a federal government for infrastructure, 47,500 high-paying jobs. And there are other lower-paying jobs spin off from that. These are not government jobs. We don't send a truck out that says U.S. federal government on it to do this work. This money goes to the private sector to create jobs. And so while we've been working to try to create jobs, Republicans, excuse me, have been throwing up their hands, or worse, standing in the way of progress. Our #1 goal was to get our economy back on track. I repeat, the Republicans' #1 goal is to defeat President Obama. What a shame. But, Mr. President, we're resolute in our commitment to restoring the economy. That's why we propose the Veterans Jobs Corps Act, a measure that fulfills our promise to the brave men and women who've dedicated 11 years of their lives to making our lives safer. President Obama kept his promise to end the war in Iraq and wind down the war in Afghanistan. The war in Iraq is over. And each year, about 200,000 service members re-enter the civilian workforce. That's the way it is right now. As this new generation of veterans returns home, ready to work, it's our job to make sure they have the opportunity to work, to succeed. The bill that's now before the Senate, Veteran Jobs Corps Act, will invest in our returning service members, easing the sometimes difficult transition back to civilian life with training programs. The measure will also offer priority hiring for veterans who want to become first responders, as we've talked already, firefighters, police officers, EMTs, and it will create jobs for veterans restoring forests, parks, coasts, public lands. These are really good jobs. These are really important jobs. Mr. President, we tried this once before when we were really struggling as a country during the Great Depression. We had the Works Progress Administration. We had the Civilian Conservation Corps. In my little town of Searchlight, Nevada, there are numerous projects that were developed by these individuals during the Great Depression. They would fix up watering holes, put in windmills, build walkways, do these things. Many of them are still in existence. So I commend the Senior Senator from Florida, Senator Bill Nelson, and the Junior Senator from Montana, Senator John Tester, for their work in this legislation. Unfortunately, we once again face Republican obstruction. I repeat, Mr. President, something I said a few minutes ago. Since we took control of the Senate in 2006, 2007, Republicans have mounted an unprecedented 380 filibusters. This is outrageous. This obstruction exceeds anything ever seen before in the Senate. And this is not using Romney-Ryan math. These are numbers that are actual. These are valid numbers. By comparison, in Lyndon Johnson's 6 years as Majority Leader, I could ask everyone here to take a guess as to how many filibusters he had to overcome. Remember, these were the years, and he was president, you had the civil rights stuff going on, all kinds of problems. Everyone would fail the test. He had to overcome one filibuster. 380. So I hope Republican colleagues will join us tomorrow as we vote to advance this measure. It's too bad we have had to file cloture on moving to proceed to this bill. The heroes who fought for their country overseas shouldn't have to fight for a job once they get home. Tomorrow also marks the 11th anniversary of September 11th terrorist attacks. The date is a reminder that through more than a decade of war, the bravery and dedication of Americans' armed forces have never wavered. And it's a reminder that our commitment to those fine young men and women should never waver either. Mr. President, I move to proceed to calendar number 476 S3457.
Clerk will report.
Motion to proceed to calendar number 476 S3457, a bill to require the Secretary of Veterans Affairs to establish a Veterans Job Corps and for other purposes.
Mr. President, at 5 p.m. today, the Senate will proceed to executive session to consider the nomination of Stephanie Marie Rose to be a United States District Judge for the Southern District of Iowa, with 30 minutes of debate equally divided and controlled. At 5:30, there will be a roll call vote on confirmation of the Rose nomination. I now ask unanimous consent. There will be a moment of silence at 4:55 today, 4:55 p.m. today, for the 40th anniversary of the Munich Olympics massacre.
Without objection.
Would the chair announce the business of the day?
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, senators are permitted to speak up to 10 minutes each.
I would note the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
President.
Senator from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask unanimous consent that further proceedings in the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to speak about two claims that were made at the recent Democratic convention that I believe require a response. Obviously, the Republican convention went first, and so they didn't have an opportunity to respond to everything that was said. But I think there are two things, as I said, that were claimed that just aren't true. The first is that Republican policies caused the economic recession, so that in the Democrats' view, electing Governor Romney would simply return us to those same allegedly failed policies. Second, it was said by several spokesmen on the Democratic side that there were no new big or new ideas coming out of the Republican convention, so that you might as well give President Obama another 4 years in office. And I'd like to respond to both of those claims. First, President Obama and his supporters would like Americans to believe that the so-called Bush tax cuts, deficits, and deregulation caused the Great Recession. Those are the Republican policies that got us into the mess, they say. The facts show this is not true. As James Pethokoukis of the American Enterprise Institute asks, if the 2001 and 2003 tax cuts caused the Great Recession, then why does President Obama want to keep most of them? And why did he sign a 2-year extension of those tax cuts a year and a half ago? Well, that's a good question. Obama supporters also claim that huge deficits resulting from these 2001 and 2003 tax bills caused the recession. But here are the facts, according to the Congressional Budget Office, nonpartisan. The 2001 and 2003 tax relief has only been responsible for 16% of the swing from surplus to deficit that they had estimated. And if you look at the upper income tax relief only, that relief makes up just 4% of the swing. So it is impossible to say that the tax cuts on the rich caused the recession. The maximum that the Congressional Budget Office can identify is potentially 4%. And it's also important to note that since the CBO doesn't take into account the pro-growth effect of marginal tax rate reductions, which all economists agree with, these numbers are even likely smaller than 4%. Over that same period of time, new spending, this is the real problem, and interest on that spending were 12 times as responsible as the upper income tax reductions. So the real culprit here is not reducing the tax rate on Americans, and especially those who are in the wealthier brackets, but rather the new spending that the federal government engaged in. That's the cause of the deficits. And that did have an impact eventually on our ability to recover from the Great Recession. One other note on this, the rich people, even though their tax rates were cut, ended up paying a far bigger percentage of taxes after the Bush tax cuts. The upper bracket earners paid, according to CBO again, that in 2008 and 2009, the years for which they have figures, the top 20% of taxpayers paid 90% of income taxes, 94% of income taxes. Before the Bush tax cuts, before 2001, that same top 20% paid only 81%. So the tax cuts in the upper income tax brackets resulted in an increase of the amount, total dollar amount of taxes paid by the upper income people from 81% to 94%. So you can't even make the argument that it was less fair. If anything, the upper income folks obviously paid a lot more, 94% of all the taxes, all of the income taxes paid. Now, if deficits are the problem that the Democrats are talking about, then President Obama would clearly make the problem worse. As Pethokoukis notes, and I'm quoting now, the most recent Obama budget, according to CBO, would add $6.4 trillion more to the federal budget deficit over the next decade, leaving debt as a share of the economy stuck at around 76% of GDP versus 37% pre-recession, end of quote. Think about it. The Obama budget leaves us with 76% debt as a share of GDP as opposed to 37% before the recession. So if debt and deficits are a problem, it's far worse under President Obama's budget than before. But again, it turns out that's not really what caused the Great Recession. Nor was it the third item that has been pointed to, and that's deregulation. Deregulation under President Bush did not cause the problem. As Pethokoukis writes, and I quote again, Glass-Steagall ended during the Clinton administration, and studies have found no evidence that any rule changes by the Bush SEC contributed to the financial crisis, end of quote. Glass-Steagall is the law that used to regulate how banks made investments. That law was eventually repealed during the Clinton administration. The Bush SEC, that stands for Securities and Exchange Commission, and there are rules changes in every administration for the SEC. He is making the point that there is no evidence that any particular rule change in the SEC had anything to do with the financial crisis. So it wasn't the tax cuts, it wasn't the deficit, and it wasn't deregulation. What did cause the recession? AEI's Peter Wallison has put it simply this way, quote, the financial crisis was a result of government housing policy. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were the implementers of a substantial portion of the government housing policy. Now, I would note, Republicans in Congress tried to reform Fannie and Freddie, but we were opposed by Democratic members, both in the House and in the Senate, including then-Senator Barack Obama. Most experts, I believe, Mr. President, will agree that the biggest reason for the collapse that occurred after 2006 was the housing market. The sale of all of these mortgages that weren't worth the paper they were written on, and when that paper was all added together, bundled together, and sold in big chunks to investors, and they found out that their investment wasn't worth what they had paid for it, you had a crash. And you had several people on Wall Street that went bankrupt as a result of that crash. That's the reality. The bottom line is that there's no Republican policy that caused the recession. So it's bogus for the President to keep saying that Governor Romney would just return us to the, quote, same failed policies. The second claim is that there were no new big Republican ideas to come out of the GOP convention. And I submit that that claim reveals just how radical the Obama team's economic policies are. It is true that Governor Romney's ideas for economic recovery are not new, but they are big. In fact, his faith in the American people and the free enterprise system are a very big idea. Not new, but tried and tested as the basis for creating the wealthiest nation ever on earth. Capitalism and free markets have lifted the standard of living for more people around the world than any government program or any other system. Planned economies compare very poorly to the free enterprise system of America. As Margaret Thatcher once famously observed, the problem with socialism is that eventually you run out of other people's money. Yes, a key theme of Republican convention was freedom, opportunity, and earned success. Americans did build our own success. To the extent that government provided any infrastructure along the way, it was paid for by taxes that Americans paid on what they earned because of their success. And yes, this is in contrast to the theme of the Democratic Convention, that our success comes from the collective, embodied mostly in government. So the bigger the government, the better. The bottom line is this: returning to free market principles and pro-growth policies will move us forward. Continued reliance on more spending Higher taxes and bigger government will not solve our problems. Mr. President, I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Gaga.
And the Senate, we just heard from the leaders here in the Senate. They're going to be taking up a judicial nomination, 5 o'clock, for the Southern District of Iowa. A vote on that nomination scheduled for 5:30. And later this week, Veterans Jobs Programs. They're also going to take a moment of silence for those killed in the Munich Olympics in 1972. The House is also back today on the other side of the Capitol. They're going to consider several bills on their calendar, including legislation to deal with mortgage and flood insurance. And you can watch the House on our companion network, C-SPAN. Now we're going to take a look at the congressional agenda. This is from today's Washington Journal.
This morning to talk about the legislative agenda for Congress are Pete Kasperowicz from The Hill. He's the Floor Action blog reporter, and Jason Dick, House editor of Roll Call. Thanks to both of you for being here. Jason Dick, we're seeing that Congress may only be in for 2 weeks. What are the top priorities, and why such a brief session?
It's actually a little less than 2 weeks, and that's primarily the House. We'll have a full 5-day work schedule, exhausting, I'm sure, this week, and then Monday and Tuesday will be off because of the Jewish High Holy Days. They'll come back on Wednesday and Thursday and Friday of the following week. So it's really 1.5 weeks.
And why such a short time here?
Well, part of it is the conventions. The conventions have gradually moved toward Labor Day as opposed to July 4th. I remember, even 8 years ago we had July conventions, and some of the political analysts, I think, believe that it is, as long as they pushed it a little bit closer to Election Day, they could bring some advantage of that. So that's part of it. Right now we also have a Congress that particularly in the House, that really believes in keeping some of their members back in the districts. And so the way that the schedule works out, sometimes it feels like they're rarely here. So they've been gone for 5 weeks, and they're going to be here again like a week and a half, and then they're off for another week. And then theoretically they're back for 1 more week, and then they go home until the elections. And then the lame duck starts when everything will be resolved.
Pete Kasperowicz, top issues on the agenda.
They have to do spending for 2013. We have about 2 weeks left before the end of the fiscal year, and so they've agreed already. In fact, they did this before they left for the break. They've agreed to a 6-month extension of spending for the next year, and that will avoid all the talk about possible shutdown, which would play into the election, which I think no party wants. And so they will be saved from this. None of us will be writing shutdown stories once they pass the bill. Then there are the 2 big issues remaining for the year would be taxes. What happens at the end of this year? Do the tax levels go up, or do they stay the same for some? And then the sequester. What happens to this big looming deadline of January where we have to start cutting money out according to the law passed last year. Those issues will be dealt with, we're pretty sure, in November and December.
If you'd like to talk about the congressional agenda, here are the numbers to call. Democrats, 202-737-0001. Republicans, 202-737-0002. And independent callers, 202-628-0205. Jason Dick, we're seeing some headlines about the Farm Bill and farmers. The New York Times says as Congress returns, it's politics as usual and a face-off with angry farmers. Are we likely to see farmers coming to Congress to lobby, and what will we hear for them?
I mean, we haven't seen any sort of suggestion that there will be tractors, you know, taking the mall at this point, but I actually was in Missouri last week in covering the McCaskill Senate race, and it's amazing how often the Farm Bill comes up among sort of these regular folks that members of Congress and the presidential candidates say that they want to reach. And there is a lot of anxiety about whether Congress can find a way to get a Farm Bill done. I mean, you know, sometimes the Farm Bill is delayed a year. There are often fights about it, whether they're over payment, how much farmers get, or how much the food stamp program gets, so forth. But the thought that in the middle of a relatively brutal drought, there would be a you know, no Farm Bill to take home until the election is a little disturbing, I think, to a lot of the people who produce, you know, the bulk of the food supply in this country.
What kinds of things was Senator McCaskill hearing from constituents as she was out on the campaign trail? It
sort of depended what the audience was, and depending on where she was. If she went to her alma mater, so.
And I ask if other proceedings on the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, as many of my colleagues know, I have been a strong and enthusiastic advocate of Stephanie Rose to serve as a district court judge in Iowa's Southern Judicial District. I was honored to recommend to the President that he nominate this outstanding attorney, and today I encourage my colleagues to vote for her confirmation when the vote occurs later this afternoon. Let me begin by first thanking Senator Leahy and his staff for their hard work in advancing Ms. Rose's nomination. I also want to thank my senior colleague from Iowa, Senator Grassley, for his invaluable support and assistance. For all the years that we have served together here in the Senate, which now goes on, I think, 27 years now, Senator Grassley and I have cooperated in a spirit of goodwill on judicial nominations in our state. I am proud that we are continuing Iowa's fine tradition regarding judicial selections. I can honestly say that Senator Grassley has never opposed one of my selectees. I have never opposed one of his, even when there's been a different president in the White House, depending upon the party that's in control of the Congress. I think we have both been very judicious, if I might use that word, in our selection of people for the bench. I say that both on behalf of Senator Grassley and I think myself. And so therefore we have worked together in this very close spirit of cooperation. I also want to thank Senator Grassley's staff, in particular Jeremy Paris, Ted Lehman, and Senator Grassley's Chief of Staff, David Young, for their support and their help in advancing the nomination. On my staff, I want to thank my Chief of Staff, Brian Alberg, Dan Goldberg, Derek Miller, and Pam Smith, all of who have worked very hard to make sure that we had a thorough interview process, a thorough vetting of the candidates, and to make sure that we got to the point today where her vote will be coming up later this afternoon. Mr. President, Stephanie Rose possesses in abundance the personal and professional qualities that we expect from those that we consider to take on the profound responsibilities of a federal judge. She is a superb attorney, and among jurists, prosecutors, and the defense bar, she has a reputation as someone who is unfailingly fair and ethical, and who possesses exceptional legal ability, intellect, integrity, and judgment. As Charles Larson, the former United States Attorney for the Northern District of Iowa under President George W. Bush, wrote to the Judiciary Committee that Ms. Rose, quote, has all the requisite abilities and traits to serve all litigants of the Southern District of Iowa in the manner expected of a federal judge. Ms. Rose would be a distinguished member of the judiciary, end quote. Ms. Rose was born in Topeka, Kansas, moved to Mason City, Iowa when she was 4. Both of her parents were public school teachers. She and her husband, Rob, have 2 children, Kyle and Missy. Ms. Rose has 2 sisters, one of whom was adopted after coming to the family as a foster child. One of 5 foster children her parents welcomed into their home. After graduating from Mason City High School, Ms. Rose earned her bachelor's degree with honors from the University of Iowa in just 3 years. Then she earned her Doctor of Jurisprudence from the University of Iowa College of Law in just 2 years, graduating in the top 5% of her class. She could easily have commanded a big salary with a top law firm. Instead, she opted for public service and long hours as a federal prosecutor, working to uphold the rule of law, making our neighborhoods safer, and advancing the cause of justice. And I might add that she served as a federal prosecutor under district attorneys appointed both by Democratic presidents and Republican presidents. In 2009, the Senate unanimously confirmed Ms. Rose to become U.S. Attorney in the Northern District of Iowa, having previously served 12 years as an Assistant U.S. Attorney. Even before becoming U.S. Attorney, she was lead counsel in 260 felony cases and made 34 oral arguments before the Eighth Circuit. She received a national award from the Department of Justice for her work in prosecuting the largest unlawful Internet pharmacy case in the United States. As U.S. Attorney, Ms. Rose has helped make Iowa and our nation safer, reduced violent crime and gang violence, and promoted civil rights. In addition, she has the distinction of serving on the Attorney General's Advisory Committee. It is no surprise that the American Bar Association gave Ms. Rose a unanimous, well-qualified rating, the highest rating by the American Bar Association. Finally, Mr. President, I want to comment on the historic nature of her confirmation. Ms. Rose was the first woman to be confirmed as U.S. Attorney in Iowa's Northern District. And when confirmed later today, she will be the first woman confirmed as a U.S. District Court Judge in Iowa's Southern District. Ms. Rose is a person of truly outstanding intellect, integrity, and character. She is exceptionally well qualified to serve as a United States District Judge for the Southern District of Iowa. I urge all of my colleagues to support her nomination. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that Courtney Zinner and Jessica Cullen be granted 4 privileges for the duration of today's proceedings.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
And Senator Harkin there just talking about Stephanie Rose. She's been nominated to the U.S. District Judge seat for Southern Iowa. He's talking about his home state there. And the nomination, Stephanie Rose was a chief prosecutor in the Postville raid. That was where nearly 400 immigrant workers were arrested at the agri-processors meatpacking plant in Postville, Iowa back in 2008. That was the largest single raid of a workplace in U.S. history up to that time. And eventually 300 workers were convicted under her judicial rulings on document fraud charges, and the majority of those served 5-month prison sentences before being deported. We will have a vote on the Rose nomination. It's scheduled for 5:30 Eastern Time this afternoon. In the meantime, let's take a look at the legislative agenda for both houses from this morning's Washington Journal.
Also says that everybody has a right to have a AK-47 or something that's built for no reason except the well-regulated militia, which is our armed forces. This is outrageous.
You know, let me ask you. You said you've lived a long life so far, and you said that you remember the best time. What was that best time?
The best time was during World War II, after World War II. I was born and raised in the depth of the Depression, when we had in many areas 100% unemployment.
Okay, we'll leave it there and look at this op-ed piece briefly by Charles Koch. He wrote this for the Wall Street Journal, the chairman and CEO of Koch Industries, someone who our caller just mentioned. Corporate cronyism harms America. It says when businesses feed at the federal trough, they threaten public support for businesses and free markets. Let's go on to Aaron, an independent caller in Hardinsburg, Indiana. Hi, Aaron.
Hello.
Good morning.
So I guess my issue really covers pretty much Democrats and Republicans from Congress down to local levels of government. Because one issue that has yet to been brought up and has kind of slid under all social issues that are being brought up right now, including religious issues and education and all that, is issues of labor. And by that I mean, you hear a lot of people talking about illegal immigrants coming to the country, but what you don't hear about is a page on the IRS website of 1099 subcontractor fraud. People are getting paid under the table in our own country that are American citizens, which is something that is not brought up and not played up as a huge issue, though it's definitely an issue if it's getting put up on the IRS tax website.
Jason Dick, any chance Congress would be taking up issues along the lines that Aaron called about?
It's pretty unlikely. They've had several opportunities in the last few years when things were not as tense and polarized to address immigration, and they did not. And it's remains to be seen whether there's an appetite for that in the coming years, but it's unlikely to happen anytime soon.
Park City, Illinois. Pat is on our Republicans line. Good morning, Pat.
Hello. I had voted for Republicans last year, although I did vote for Obama. But kind of disappointed that Republicans didn't do what they said that they were going to do. They made all kinds of promises, and all we see is a lot of problems from the Congress and the others, the House Representatives and all the other stuff. But it's just very saddening to not see a lot of things pass for what we already have, you know, like the Farm Bill and other things like that. And I also have one comment. Please read Rolling Stone magazine. It was a free magazine that I had gotten, and kind of explains what Romney's about, you know. And I was kind of disappointed to hear what he was about, dismantling companies and taking jobs overseas. And I do support the unions, and I do support the farm bills, you know, because people do have to eat. But I'm hoping that they can come together and, you know, not have too many discriminations against the poor and the middle class, because we are the people of the United States of America. That's all I have to say, but thank you very much.
Pete Kasperowicz with the Hill, a response for our caller.
Well, again, everyone's unhappy. A lot of Republicans came up at the end of their spring and summer session, and they weren't happy either, and they were saying we wanted to cut a lot more. What ended up happening is they wrestled the government down to almost a spending freeze, but not quite. And it was interesting to watch how even when you don't freeze spending when it's at record high levels, the anger that happens, and a lot of people worry about what happens to women and children and what happens to people who rely on these programs. So it's two totally different ways of looking at it. The people who want to defend those programs don't want any cut, but they also want growth in those programs. A lot of Republicans who want to see them cut, you know, they get in trouble even just for slowing the rate of growth sometimes. So again, money's central to all these questions, and it's driving every debate they have. And again, it's the reason for everything being slow.
Comment on Twitter says, the government that does nothing does the least amount of damage. Why is everyone afraid of the lame duck Congress? Jason Dick, what's the danger of inaction, of Congress not acting before the end of the year? Lay out some of the looming fiscal cliff issues for us.
Well, on the, I hesitate to call this the positive side, but if Congress were to do nothing after the election, if they were all to head down to the Bahamas or something like that, go, marlin fishing, then the tax rates would spring back to the levels that we were at during the Clinton administration. So the top tax rate, I believe, would be 39.6%, and some of the other rates would go up. The payroll tax extension would also go away, so that we would have everyone would feel that almost immediately. There would be more withheld for Social Security in all of our paychecks, and then the automatic defense and domestic spending cuts would go into effect. That now, as I said, I hesitate to call it positive, but on the positive side of that, the deficit would be cut, and this has become like the big reason for almost, as Pete was saying, that every bill that comes down the pike is framed in a spending fight. So the deficit would go down. What almost every credible economist in the country is saying also is that this would also put us right back into the recession, because people would have a lot less money to spend just on a day-to-day, never mind taking a vacation or looking at replacing your 10-year-old car. This would be, you would probably go to brand X of detergent because you just literally have less money in your paycheck. As well as the fact that people are anticipating having less at the end of the year because they'll be paying more in taxes. So some of the, even the more conservative estimates are somewhere from 1 to 3%, cut in gross national product.
Candidate Mitt Romney was on NBC's Meet the Press yesterday. He was asked about defense spending and the automatic cuts that are part of the sequestration plan. Let's take a listen to what candidate Romney had to say.
I thought it was a mistake on the part of the White House to propose it. I think it was a mistake for Republicans to go along with it. The President was responsible for coming out with specific changes that he'd make to the defense budget. It was supposed to have come out this last week. He has violated the law that he, in fact, signed. The American people need to understand how it is that our defense is going to be so badly cut. My own plan, by the way, to bring down the rates of taxation while maintaining the revenues that come into the government is by making sure that we don't lower taxes on high-income people. We're not going to have high-income people pay less of the tax burden than they pay today. That's not what's going to happen. I do want to bring taxes down for middle-income people. In particular, I want middle-income Americans not to have to pay taxes on interest and dividends and capital gains.
Before we get your reaction to that, let's take a look at other comments made over the weekend. This is Paul Ryan, candidate for vice president on the Republican ticket. He was on CBS's Face the Nation answering why he voted for these automatic cuts. Let's take a listen.
I did. You know why I voted for it? Because I was working to find common ground with Democrats to get a down payment on deficit reduction. I worked with President Obama to find common ground to get a down payment on deficit reduction. It wasn't a big down payment, but it was a step in the right direction. Here's the issue. Bob Woodward just wrote this in his book. The devastating defense cuts that are now coming due were insisted upon by the Obama administration so that they would not have to face another debt ceiling increase before the election.
But Congressman,
that's putting politics ahead of national security. More to the point, Nora, I authored the bill, brought it to the floor and passed it to prevent the president's irresponsible, devastating defense cuts from occurring by cutting wasteful Washington spending in other areas of government to replace these defense cuts.
That was Paul Ryan on CBS. He mentioned Bob Woodward. He'll actually be our guest on Washington Journal next Monday. You can catch him then. I want to get your reaction to both those comments, but also what it means for members of Congress as they go home and deal with their votes on issues like the sequestration. Pete Kasperowicz.
No one looks good here because the cuts are coming because they put together what they call the super committee. And everyone, we all worked like heck trying to figure out who's going to be on it and what's going to happen. And then almost when we were ready to go, it just drops out and it's over. They slapped super on this committee name, and nothing super happened, nothing happened at all. They failed at it. Now we were actually stuck with the Plan B, which no one's ever happy with. So there's a lot of actual, I think, embarrassment around town still that this was their big grand scheme to sort of kick it up to this chosen group of people who are going to be all powerful. And then it ended pretty quickly, and suddenly we were all looking at how much are the cuts, and here they come. And so I think everyone's kind of backpedaling. It would actually not surprise me to see some kind of agreement late this year that in some ways gets around these cuts. No one seems to be happy with the defense cuts. You also package it with the tax change coming. There's a lot there to mix together and combine into some mega deal, and we might actually see some super result by the end of the year.
Jason Dick.
It is interesting to see the pressure begin to grow in this town. It's almost as if there's been this collective dream having of, we've all had that nightmare anxiety dream where we wake up and it's the last day of class and we have not studied or gone to class, but we have this final, the blue book exam. And it seems like there's a little bit of that going on with Congress. However much anyone in the House, the Senate, Democrat, Republican would like to distance themselves, it was a law that was duly passed and signed by the President. They all bear responsibility for it as much as they'd like to distance themselves. There is some speculation that some people were actually rooting for the failure of the supercommittee so if they could have leverage on this. I mean, regardless of who designed it and under what sort of nefarious motives and so forth, this is what they have to deal with. I think that they are a little bit in denial of just how complicated it is and just how difficult it will be to get an agreement toward the end of the year.
Jason Dick, House editor of Roll Call, and Pete Kasperowicz, Floor Action blog reporter and creator for The Hill. They're both on Twitter. You can find them. You can also send us tweets to @CSpanWJ if you want your comments shared on the air. Let's go to Las Vegas, Nevada, and hear from David on our Democrats line. Good morning.
Good morning. I've heard in passing a Democratic prospect that the country should allow the driving off of the fiscal cliff. I was just wondering about any opinion on that. I see Romney squirming at the idea that or however you say the word, sequestration, would it release Norquist's grip on the congressional Republicans? Would it actually raise revenues? I mean, what about that idea that I've just kind of heard in passing?
Jason Dick.
There has been some speculation that if the fiscal cliff is driven off of, to use a strange, awkward sentence construction there, and I apologize for it, that this would release, because taxes are going up, this would release not just congressional Republicans, but anybody who is hesitant to raise taxes from their pledge to, because now that all taxes have gone up, it's just a matter of lowering them. I think that, I mean, we have no way of knowing just how serious that is. I mean, it's interesting how quickly rumors get picked up in Washington. But I think, again, it doesn't change the underlying problem, which is that they have scheduled precious little legislative time to deal with these issues, and they are not doing themselves any favor in the next couple of weeks by sort of furtively coming into town, passing a few spending legislative bills so that they're not under pressure there, and then leaving again to campaign. So it would theoretically release them from any kind of pressure because they'd only be lowering taxes at that point. But that's a real sort of gamble that I don't know if anybody would really want to seriously take. And it sort of speaks to just how much pressure people are feeling that they would sort of speculate on this stuff.
Let's hear from Brad, an independent in Fayetteville, Arkansas. Hi, Brad.
Hey, how you doing?
Good.
I have two suggestions for advice for the budget for the deficit. My first suggestion would be cut a lot of the military. I know the two guys you're with disagree with me, but as I see it, the war on terror is being conducted basically by covert operations, special Marine trainings, and drones. I don't think we need a standing military to do that. If we could leave out the standard military, that would save us a hell of a lot of money. Also, I think that we need to end the war on drugs, particularly marijuana. If marijuana was legalized, not decriminalized, not made legal for just medical purposes, but actually legalized, that would break the back of the Mexican mafia who supplies it, because 60% of their profits come from the sale of that drug. It would also increase dramatically more revenue and more services in the legal places that could grow them here in the United States. I think if we followed the same model with pot as we did with alcohol, as far as having tight controls on who grows it, who distributes it, who sells it, and who uses it, I think we could have a success, and I think we could save a lot of money. But I know we have a big, big bureaucracy that's grown up since the Controlled Substances Act.
Okay, well, we don't know, Brad, if our guests agree or disagree with you, but we'll get their thoughts as reporters, as journalists who cover these issues. Any traction for the issues that he brings up?
The war spending will, the war money is coming down, but a lot of people want to cut it further. And this, again, this is one of these issues. We'll see how it ends up. You have probably most Democrats agreeing with the caller. You have a lot of Republicans agreeing with too. This is an issue that splits Republicans pretty widely. You have a bunch of people saying, let's cut everything. And then more of the old line Republicans who have been here longer tend to say, let's cut everything but defense. So this issue, again, it's part of the intractable debate we have. How does it end? How do we figure out how to go forward here? And then on the drug issue, I'm sure we don't spend nearly as much on the war on drugs, but Ron Paul made a good bid a couple times this year. We saw some bills he introduced that he would take a step toward legalizing marijuana. I'm not sure how much that saves. It's nothing like what we'd see in the savings for reducing military spending. But again, those ideas are out there, and I think it will be part of the mix. I think if there is some big agreement done, I think you will see military cuts at some point. I think you have to.
Jason Dick, one issue we haven't talked about is the Veterans Jobs Bill that's before the Senate. Fill us in on that. Are we expected to see any action?
We will see some action tomorrow in the Senate. The Senate will take a vote on whether to take up a bill by Senator Bill Nelson of Florida that is designed to sort of open up more avenues for employing veterans. The way that this could proceed and we could get some sort of action and bipartisan vote, which is no guarantee of success in the House, but we could also see it snared up by some demands that they're over how many amendments should be offered. This has tripped up a lot of legislation in the Senate this year where Republicans think that they are being sort of cut off from a lot of avenues of debate by Harry Reid, the majority leader, and so a lot of legislation has sort of ended in a dead road. Now, over the summer, there were actually a few success stories in the Senate where they did get an agreement. They let a lot of amendments through that perhaps wasn't to the liking of everyone, but they did pass on bipartisan basis the transportation bill, which was then signed into law later on, and then they passed the farm bill, which is waiting for House action. So it remains to be seen, but no one really wants to disappoint veterans in an election year. So we might see a better chance of success for that.
Here's a tweet in from Maverick giving his opinion. I support off the cliff, using that as a hashtag. Let the Bush tax cuts expire. I dare Republicans to block a tax cut for the bottom 97%. No pledges, period. Let's get back to the phones and hear from David, a Republican down in Houston, Texas. Good morning.
Good morning. I've got an answer to part of the problem that we have with our federal government right now, and that's in regards to Congress. I think it's time we have term limits. I think any time you have a career 35, 40, 45, 50-year member of the House or the Senate, I think it's way past time. I see nowhere in the Constitution or by our forefathers where we were to grant careers of that length of time to a person that is supposed to be representing the people. That's absolutely too long. We've got people from California to New York that have committed felonies that are serving in our Congress and in our Senate. We have people that get so ingrained into our bureaucracy as politicians that millions of dollars go into their spouses' banking careers or chicken of the sea, Miss Pelosi and her husband, people who are in real estate, Mr. Rangel or Mr. What's his name, Barney Frank. We absolutely need to have term limits where once they have a combination of the Senate and the House of 20 years, the next time they come up for election, they have to get out of office. The next thing is the only reason why they would ever be allowed to be in a federal elective office would be for the vice presidency or the presidency of the United States.
All right, David, let's leave it there and get a response from Jason Dick, House editor of Roll Call. You've been out on the campaign trail a little bit, getting a sense of voters' perspectives. are they feeling like David is, that the members that represent their House or Senate races should be turned out because they've been in too long?
I think that there is a lot of frustration on the campaign trail, and what we'd previously seen in sort of previous election cycles is that people are upset with Congress, but they like their own congressman. That's changing a little bit as some of the dysfunction settles in, particularly in the House. But to that, the ultimate term limit is Election Day, and I mean there is nothing preventing the voters of Missouri from denying Claire McCaskill a second term. There's nothing from the voters of St. Louis from denying William Lacey Clay, another term in the House. So these are that is the ultimate check on power and term limits. And yes, do incumbents have an inherent advantage in terms of name recognition and so forth? Yes, of course they do. But the voters have the ultimate power, as we saw in the election 2 years ago, when I don't think anyone anticipated the level of turnover that we saw in the House. So the voters ultimately have that right. Also, I'd mention too that in California at the state level has had term limits for the members of the House of Delegates and their Senate. And I think most people would take a sort of a glance at California, at their budget situation, at the way that they run the state, and say that there are several problems, of course, that don't apply to whether somebody is term limited or not, but term limits have not worked to a more perfect union in California, for instance.
The Washington Post looks at the race for Senate control. It says Congressman Aiken's race for the Senate seat in Missouri is just one pothole in Republicans' road to taking the Senate. You can see a map that shows the states that are in play. It says Republicans need a net gain of 4 seats in November to win control of the Senate. Of the 33 up for re-election in 2012, the Washington Post team considers 6 to be toss-ups. Pete Kasperowicz, the Postal Service. We haven't gotten to talk about that yet this morning. It was a hot issue earlier in the summer as the Postal Service asked for help dealing with bankruptcy problems and all kinds of economic issues, all kinds of fiscal problems. Where are they at, and are we seeing anything move forward?
We haven't seen the House do anything yet, and this is an issue that could come up later, but and it's interesting to watch it because what the Republicans want in their bill, as usual, there's a split over how to handle this. The Republicans want to see in large part what the post office is in some ways doing, which is reducing their size and scale and closing offices and giving people incentive to leave if they've worked there for a lot of years. I've thought, now I don't know this, but I think in a lot of ways the Republicans get what they want by letting it roll out. In other words, letting the Postal Service deal with the situation it has now. Democrats are not happy with this. They'd rather see changes that allow you to take back some of the money they've overpaid to their pension fund and things like that to sort of stay solvent. They're losing $25 million a day, I think, and I think $5 billion a quarter, if that's right. So in large part, the Republicans get what they want by not doing anything. They get their shrunken Postal Service if they want. The service is talking about no weekend delivery and shorter hours in offices. So I'd be surprised if you see the House rush back and do this anytime soon. It could come up in November and December, though, in some way.
And yet, Jason Dick, Postal Service is something that all congressional districts have represented and their constituents use. Is that playing out politically with House members?
I didn't hear a whole lot of that out on the trail, but certainly there is a true emotional connection that people have to their post offices. I'm from a rural area of Arizona myself. We did not live where I was growing up in an incorporated area. We're outside of Cottonwood. And the post office was literally the address on my father's driver's license for years until the fire department made him get they made up a physical address to put on and it was in some sort of fire map for the Forest Service. So people have a real connection to their to their post offices. They know their postal, carrier. And I think once these cuts start to hit, if they do, as Pete was saying, you'll see a lot more people engage in this and say, wait a second, you're not supposed to close my post office, close the other guy's post office, or just ferret out the waste, fraud, and abuse, as people like to say. But I don't know if it's really hit people just how difficult the days are for the post office ahead.
Jay Thompson tweets in response something we were talking about a few moments ago. It says, term limits thwart the will of voters. Wayne, North Carolina. David on our Independence line. Good morning.
Thanks for taking my call. First of all, I'm a World War II Korean and Vietnam veteran. I don't need anyone to tell me thank you for my services. What I'm concerned about, this country has a moral obligation to take care of the military. And everyone should be able to serve this country, not be excluded like the 5 Romney boys. So why haven't they served to defend this country? And I will hang up and let the answer be from these 2 gentlemen. Bye.
Jason Dick?
It's interesting to see this increasing divide as we get further and further away from the time when we had a universal draft. The draft ended in the 70s after the Vietnam War, and increasingly we've come to rely on a smaller part of the population that's more professionalized to fight our wars. This puts an enormous amount of pressure on the military. You know, some people have gone to the theaters of war in Iraq and Afghanistan multiple times. I think everyone knows at least somebody in their family or somebody who's a close friend who, you know, they know that they're even if they're just in the Guard, even if they're a lawyer in the JAG Corps, they're heading to places that are some of the most dangerous places on earth. So there is I think that even if people don't serve in the military themselves, they feel this obligation. In the Vice President's speech on Wednesday evening, on Thursday evening in Charlotte, I mean, his own son is a war veteran and I believe is in the Army, and he, you know, said that this is the one true obligation that we have. So the political parties seem aware of just how important veterans, you know, can be to the process and to the growth of the country, but they will likely be hit along with everybody else in terms of like budget cuts if the sequester happens, if it kicks in, and so that again, it's another emotional thing that people like. There's a connection that people have to the military, to the families that serve in it. And if they are, you know, if they're affected in some sort of way that's untoward, there might be political consequences that nobody really could have considered before.
Michelle in Holyoke, Massachusetts, Democrats line.
Good morning.
Oh, good morning, Michael. Excuse me.
Yes, and I'm so glad to be on. Now, it seems to me that running this country and everything is really, really easy. Let me give you a scenario. You take a Democratic mother and a Republican husband, and you got 4 kids. Now, do you think they're going to bicker in their household about how to get things right and their kids suffer? You run the country like you run your household. You do what's best for everybody in this country, Democrats and Republicans. This bickering is nonsense. We send them there to Washington. We should be able to fire them when they're not doing their job. They're sitting there bickering. They're rich, so this doesn't bother them. You know, we're the ones who's being affected. So I hope a lot of Republicans and Democrats, and I hope a lot of people in the world is listening. You run this country like you run your house. You do what's best for everybody in their house.
Michael, is that affecting your vote for your member of Congress or your senators?
Well, when I see the bickering going on, like I voted for Obama, and I think he's doing a great job, and he's being blocked at every turn. We all know why. I'm not going to say it. We all know why. So thank you for my call.
Gridlock, Pete Kasperowicz.
Yeah, it's everywhere, and you know, it's good advice. Don't fight in front of the kids, right? But they end up fighting in front of the kids. Sometimes I think it's these cameras that do it. You know, there's a lot of showboating, and they think they're on the jumbotron, and it kind of amps up everything they say, and they come out with posters and call each other names, and the chair reminds them not to be so mean. So there are some rules about how that needs to work. They don't always follow them, and again, there's no jail for being a little silly or goofy on the floor, because the person warning you not to do it is going to come up next and speak after you and maybe do the same thing. So I've thought that, actually, I think the caller is probably onto something, that there's at some level, I'm not saying they're all unprofessional, but at some level this is not always a place of work. It's a place of, it's a political platform sometimes, and what you see on your own cameras is you see it every day probably in the House and Senate.
So let's talk about what's going on behind the scenes, away from the cameras, especially as we get ready to head into this lame duck session and the fiscal cliff and so many issues on the agenda. Pete Kasperowicz, do you have a sense of how much negotiation or conversation is happening behind the scenes to prepare for that?
I think to prepare for the elections?
after the election, the lame duck session, all the big fiscal issues.
Right. There has to be, but I think in a large part, a lot of ways they're waiting for the election to happen because then someone gets an advantage depending on the result. The only time it would be status quo is if the Republicans keep the House and the Democrats hang on to the Senate. Then I think we're all in sort of this painful world of, oh God, 2 more years of more of this, you know, like more of this sort of you can't get around any issue now because everyone disagrees. There is behind-the-scenes stuff, and the hearings are somewhat productive, but they are still filmed. But they do talk when they're not on camera, I believe, occasionally, and that's where they've hammered out the big things. That's where they got the highway bill done, and that's where they did get this the 2013 spending deal done, and that's probably where they're going to have to get the fiscal cliff issues done too.
Jason Dick, are there players that you're watching for their behind-the-scenes negotiations and conversations?
It depends on which chamber you're talking about. I mean, right now, in the House at least, I think it's a pretty fascinating phenomenon because people focus on the Democrats versus the Republicans. What we have in the House is a coalition government between the Republican leadership and the Democratic leadership, and some of the more like far-right elements of the Republican Party. And so frequently for the biggest issues in the on the docket, whether it's last year's debt deal or how to fund the government and so forth, you have a lot of Democrats providing the margin for the House. And so some of the people that we're looking at, some of the deal makers are people like Steny Hoyer. They're Republicans like Joanne Emerson and Mike Simpson and Stephen LaTourette, people who have been around for a while, people who know how to work and get things done and get votes.
You'll actually see that this week too when they pass this the 2013 spending bill. You'll probably get several dozen Republicans